Is 1.1, the geographical environment, natural features, resources and neighbours of Egypt. This is Egypt here, and you can see the Nile River. This area here is the delta, this area here is the Fayum, and anything around the 3 to 18 kilometres of the river is the Kemet, and this land here is the Deseret. Background. Egyptians believed the world emerged from a mound called the Benben. The first god was both male and female. The god appeared from the mound and embodied the concept of Ma'at, and also was Ma'at. The opposing force was Isfet. So Benben meant sacred mound. It arose from the waters of chaos. Ma'at was a goddess. She represented truth, justice, peace, and stability, divine order, and Isfet was chaos. So that's how they believed their world, their creation story. This is the Temple of Abydos. It shows the Pharaoh Seti holding Ma'at. So he is upholding Ma'at. So he's trying to prove the point that he upholds the concept of Ma'at and the divine peace and justice and stability for his society at the time. So it's at the Temple of Abydos. Good evidence to write down. This is Egypt here. We have Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. These places are important. Nubia, a southern area, a southern, I guess, neighbor. Libya to the west. Syria over here, Palestine, all these areas we'll talk about. The Bedouins over here, which we'll mention a bit later. The Hittite Empire, some Greece here, Crete, which I'll talk about a bit more later. The Nile River, central to Egypt. Annual inundation happens at June to September. This allowed for a regulated season and also made the soil very fertile. So the river was so central that they divided their calendar up based on when the Nile flooded, because that meant that they could plant crops and grow their resources. So the flood happened from June to September, known as Aket. The sowing season was in spring, known as Peret, October to Feb. And summer, which is when they harvest the goods, was in March to June, the Shemuel. Herodotus describes the land of Egypt as gaining a gift. So that's a really key quote to write down. These are some important quotes you might want to get down as evidence from Herodotus. Hapi, he is the spirit of the river, and they would pray to Hapi. A poor flood would mean that there's hardship and famine because they can't grow their resources. Remember, they're very self-sufficient and rely on the Nile. This is the hymn that they would read out, so this is good evidence, the hymn to Hapi. And this, remember, Hapi is the spirit of the river. They would sing to him in order for him to look after them and ensure that there's a flood so that they have soil to grow their crops. So it says, praise to you, Hapi, sprung from the earth, come nourish Egypt. Okay, where does the Nile River start from? Two main sources, Lake Victoria, which is in Uganda, and the Blue Nile, which is in Sudan. Both of those are south of Egypt, meaning that the river flows north. Important to know. First cataract is in Aswan, which is, should be around here. I'll get a picture for you soon. Here it is, Aswan, the first cataract. And the fertile strips of land are 3 to 18 kilometres wide from where the river is. So if you have a look here, the fertile strips would be about 3 to 18 kilometres either side of the river. The southwest area of Memphis, which is just here, is known as the Fayum, which is a very lush area, very fertile, and it's also known as Shemal. And then you've got the Mebu, which is also the delta region where the river starts to separate into mini creeks or rivers. And then north of, so that's about it. The ancient Egyptians made sense of their world through the extremes of the land. So the fertile land on the banks of the Nile was known as Kemet, the black land, very fertile, lush, ordered. It represents Ma'at. The desert land, which was beyond, was known as being dangerous. This represented chaos, therefore Isfet. Tawi. So Egyptians used to believe that the land was divided into two. They still use the terms. I don't know if modern day do, but they had previously been separated into two lands known as Tawi. There was Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and each had their own pharaoh. Then Pharaoh Nama comes along. There's a war, and then he is the first true pharaoh of the united lands, of both of the united Egypt. No more just Upper and Lower Egypt as separate nations. It becomes one, and he combines the two crowns in order for that to happen. So governments control water supplies, they undertook irrigation work, they resurveyed their land, they gave employment during the flood season, which is known as corvée work. So they called for workers from all the different states to come and work during the flood. And the land and the climate inspired the Egyptian gods. So Ra was the sun god, Osiris was the god of regeneration, Seth was the god of the desert, and Hapi the god of the Nile, all in order here. Egypt's resources. So the Nile deposited silt. This meant fertile land, which meant that they could grow crops and they could breed animals. Farmers grew emmer wheat, barley, flax, fruit, vegetables, and papyrus. So this is all coming from the Black Lands, Kemet, Mart. Then the Deseret did also give minerals as well. So they quarried and mined things like limestone, granite, greywacke, diorite, sandstone, gold, copper, tin, lead, iron, natron, turquoise, alabaster, and quartzite. And this is a map of the resources, and you can see all of the little points there that indicate all of the different resources that are coming from inside of Egypt, internal to Egypt itself. Some of these even come from parts of Nubia, which are down below, and they took a lot of gold from Nubia as well, because they generally controlled that region. The Turin Papyrus, I don't expect you to read this, but it is important that you jot it down because this is good evidence. It supports the fact that there were gold mines. These come from Nubia, which is not Egyptian territory. It is Egyptian-controlled territory, but it's not within Egypt's borders. They had the Nubian gold mines. They took them from the Nubians, and they controlled that area with their viceroy, who was an Egyptian leader in Nubia. And this Turin Papyrus shows the presence of gold mines there. Good evidence for resources. Egypt's neighbours and resources. So because the Nile made Egypt very sufficient, meaning that they didn't have to communicate with other countries in order to live, they considered themselves to be a lot more superior to other countries. So they believed that Egypt was paradise on earth because they were so self-sufficient. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, there was an invasion. This shattered Egypt's sense of security and their trust in their self-sufficiency and their ability to handle themselves. So then by the Ramesside period, when you have pharaohs like Seti and Ramses coming along, they're looking to develop better relationships with foreign countries and re-establish Egypt's mighty power. So Egypt develops trading partners. And we have trading partners for things like natron, precious metals, which they exchange for things that Egypt lacked. For example, Egypt didn't have timber, they didn't have iron, silver, and lead. And they also had diplomatic marriages where Egyptian pharaohs would marry foreign princesses. Never once in the history of Egypt has a foreign princess gone across, in this period anyway, a foreign princess gone to marry a foreign prince. Never. They never sent an Egyptian princess out, only foreign princesses coming in to marry the pharaoh. But they're important for links with neighbours. Important trading links, they had Nubia and Kush for gold, cereals, cattle, as well as African trade. And we had animals in North Africa, so they got things like ivory, ebony. Then they got incense, myrrh, aromatic woods. Then they had leopard skin, giraffe skins, and ostrich eggs, all coming from Nubia. Palestine gave important corridors for communication and trade routes to Syria and Mesopotamia. Byblos had cedar wood. Cyprus had copper. Crete, Greece, and Syria. So merchant ships from Egypt would sail to the Aegean Sea to these countries to exchange emmer wheat and barley for things like spices, unguents, oils, opium, and exotic manufactured goods. Neighbours. So these were countries that Egypt controlled as their own country. So some parts of Syria, Palestine in the Ramesside period were controlled by Egypt. Libya was controlled by Egypt. Sinai was controlled by Egypt. And Nubia was definitely controlled by Egypt. So you can see some of those countries here. Sinai, we've got a lot of the Syria-Palestine region was controlled by Egypt. Nubia, very much controlled by Egypt, and Libya as well. Then we have the northern lands. So the northern lands are these lands up here, and they're a collection of small rival kingdoms, some not so small, whose borders constantly changed because of rivalries within themselves. And following the invasion of the Hyksos, future pharaohs, they needed a buffer zone so that they had protection because they were very exposed in their northern borders. So they created what's called vassal towns. So they established vassal towns where they would put Egyptian military forces in these towns and force the towns to pay tribute to Egypt and threaten that they would, destroy the town or take it over if they didn't. So then these vassal towns had to pay money to Egypt all the time in order for protection from Egypt. And they developed this sort of buffer zone here where they had some control from some of the, the more formidable forces up here. And the tribute is when they're forced to pay gifts. So the southern lands, for example, Kush, this was different. So the town in Nubia had, some towns in Nubia, all pretty much of them, had a lot of gold. And in this period, Egypt completely subdued Nubia or Kush, and they took as much control as they could of the gold, of the mines, of all that kind of stuff. And they put a viceroy of Kush in that area to control Nubia. Neighbours and hostility. So the northern and southern lands were never especially loyal to Egypt. So if they were forced to pay tribute, they did, but whenever they could, they would rebel, or there'd be some sort of a campaign. And every single year, pretty much of most pharaohs' reigns, there was some sort of a campaign in the south or the north that they had to deal with, that Egypt had to deal with them. Because if a new pharaoh came along, the vassal towns or the Egyptian-controlled areas like Nubia would begin to rebel. And it was very important that a pharaoh show his strength against these wretched lands, so sometimes they would just have campaigns just for the sake of it. Then you had nomadic lands, so the Bedouins and parts in Libya, people in Libya, the different nomadic tribes that roamed those areas and those borders, sometimes would have, mini campaigns or try and rebel there, and they'd have border raids to try and regain control of mines, etc. The benefits of having these relations with other countries. So Egypt's economy was geared to their yearly connection of the tribute and spoils and trade. So Egypt gained a lot of benefit economically from the tribute and the spoils and trade of their controlled territories and their different countries that had to pay tribute for loyalty. This allowed kings to reward their military men and also to finance their army and their navy. This was also a double-edged sword at times, because having a mighty army and navy meant that they had to keep them occupied with campaigns that brought in booty. So no campaign meant that there was unrest and that there was a threatened state. So they needed to have campaigns in order to maintain control of these territories that they needed money from. There was regular outside contact that provided Egypt with wealth, opportunities, artistic, religious stimuli, and multicultural influxes. Some of the equals to Egypt, equal in power and might: the Hyksos, the Mitanni or the Mitannian Empire, the Hittites, Hattusa, Cyprus, Crete, the northern inferiors known as the Nine Bows, which is a traditional word for the enemies of Egypt. And these are the enemies pictured on the walls of Ramesses II's temple. I think it's in Abu Simbel, yes. So his Ramesses II's temple in Abu Simbel, he shows what's called the Nine Bows, and these are depicted as Nubia, and he shows them to be, subdued and tied up, and he's trying to show, I guess, that he has control of his enemies. And this is the same image of those 9 bows, and this time the 9 bows represents the Syrian Hittite territories, which Ramses also has control over because they're all tied up, etc.